Welcome back to the NFL NBA Rectable. We have a special little NFL edition because Kevin and I, of course, last night went to the Monday Night Football game here in Oakland. So we're going to bring you some of our observations and impressions of both of the teams. Starting off with the home team, the Oakland Raiders. The first thing that just stood out, the two big signings on that defense, D'Angelo Hall and Jabril Wilson, looked really, really bad. I mean, D'Angelo Hall was burned repeatedly by Broncos wide receiver Eddie Royal. Of course, he ended up getting 9 catches for 146 yards and a touchdown. And between the two players, Hall and Wilson, there were a total of 3 personal fouls out of the 5. So they really just had a really bad start in Oakland. But what were some other things that you saw in that defense?
Well, you mentioned the big one. The pass defense was absolutely terrible, and you mentioned those 3 personal fouls. 2 of them came within 3 plays of each other. D'Angelo Hall just self-imploding on the field. And another thing with the pass defense is they didn't seem to know their assignments. I remember one big play, it was second down in Raiders territory, when Jabril Wilson, right before the snap, had to direct D'Angelo Hall where to be with his assignment, and it just looked terrible. It didn't look like they really practiced that much, and obviously they did, but they were not prepared, that defense, to take on Jay Cutler and the Denver Broncos.
Yeah, and it definitely showed. Of course, Hall ended up getting beat for a fairly long completion on that play, so he's going to need to refine that Pro Bowl form of his. He's always been a little inconsistent, I felt, but that was just, he was pretty consistent on Monday night, and that was just bad. But one of the other things that struck me about that pass defense was the pass rush. It was non-existent for the Raiders. Whether or not that was because of the Broncos' offensive line or the Raiders' defensive line, I couldn't really tell. The Broncos' offensive line played really well. Of course, they always are good. But I wasn't sure if it was just the fact that, Derek Burgess couldn't even get anywhere. They weren't getting much push at all. And so I remember there were a couple plays where Jay Cutler would drop back to pass, and there wouldn't be a black shirt within 10 yards of him. So he was standing back there all day picking apart the Raiders. Of course, ended up with 299 yards. But you mentioned one thing about the run defense. How did that look to you? That was one of the big questions coming into this season.
It looked pretty bad to me, to be honest. Denver is a team that really hasn't found that #1 running back yet, and they tore him up, basically. I remember one play, 1st and 10 on Denver's own 8. They had the ball. They were in the black hole, 10-yard run. Just like that, they get out of trouble. It seemed like they were getting 6 and 7 yards on first down runs all game long. And they only wound up with a 4.2 yard per carry average. But when it counted, they were able to knock off some big runs without having a featured back.
Yeah, definitely. So moving over to that Broncos offense, we've been talking about them. The one thing that really impressed me, first off, we mentioned him, the rookie wide receiver, Eddie Royal, 146 yards on 9 catches. He just looked really good. What else impressed you about that Broncos offense?
I really like Jay Cutler and that O-line that gave him all day to pick and choose his receivers. Jay Cutler was amazing in dissecting that Raiders defense. You mentioned Eddie Royal was big, and we haven't even talked about them not having Brandon Marshall for that game. That's their #1 option at wide receiver, and to think what Jay Cutler could do with Eddie Royal and Brandon Marshall, the rest of the league better watch out.
Yeah, definitely. Normally the Broncos are a running offense, but like you mentioned earlier, Kevin, they didn't really find a #1 running back yet. Of course, they're still probably going to rush for 100 or 1,500, something like that, as a team, as they always do. But it looks like this might sort of be transitioning into a pass offense over in Denver. But then looking at the other side, the Raiders offense, they just look like a mess. I mean, there was nothing there. They couldn't, of course, they didn't get any points on until the 4th quarter. But that running game was so touted, it was supposed to be so good. It was top 10 last year. What happened with that?
I don't know. The defensive line of Denver was really able to push and get into the backfield. That Raiders offensive line still has a lot of troubles. They're improved, but not nearly where they need to be. And Justin Fargas, he had 55 yards, but 42 came on 1 carry. Justin Fargas did not look like the same running back he was last year. McFadden looked all right. I liked what I saw from him, but he only got 9 carries, and they abandoned that running game way too early. They gave up on it early in the third quarter when they still had a shot of getting back into that game.
Yeah, well, Fargas's numbers, what Kevin was alluding to, were a little deceptive. He got in total 97 yards, but they were 55 on 17 carries and then a 142-yarder late in the fourth quarter. So those numbers are a little deceiving, not quite as good as what they're expected to be. The thing that stood out to me was, of course, there are still no playmakers at wide receiver because Jamarcus Russell, yeah, he wasn't great, but for someone in his second start, didn't play all that bad, and he really just needed help a couple times. There were 2 play-action passes in the first half where Ronald Curry was the recipient of both of the passes, dives for the ball, goes off of his hands both times. So at that point, it's not on Jamarcus Russell. He's getting the ball there where it needs to be. These were deep balls, showing off that absolute cannon that Jamarcus has for an arm. But Ronald Curry needs to make those plays. The old adage is that for a wide receiver, if the ball hits your hands, you got to make the catch. It's not even like it just barely grazed his fingertips. These were off of the palms of his hands. So if Jamarcus Russell gets any help from these wide receivers, they could actually be a decent passing offense because these couple plays really could have shifted momentum early on in the game. But what else did you see out of Jamarcus Russell?
Well, in the first half, he didn't look comfortable in the pocket at all. And of course, the offensive line didn't help him, but he was shifting his feet. He never really got his feet set. And on one of those throws to Ronald Curry that you mentioned, he threw off his back foot, and he had plenty of time to get that throw off. So he didn't look too comfortable. In the second half, when the game was all said and done, he looked a lot more comfortable. He made a few nice throws down the field, and he ended up completing over 65% of his passes, 17 for 26, 180 yards, and a couple of touchdowns. So he showed that he can play when it doesn't matter, and we'll have to wait next week against Kansas City to see how he can do when the game is still on the line.
Yeah, I have a really bad feeling for the Raiders that it's going to be one of those seasons that, they have a chance to make those plays, but they just come up a little short. Of course, those play-action passes I mentioned, and that one fumble that Jamarcus had in the first quarter where they would have tied the game, they were going down the field, looked like they could tie the game, and the ball just slips out of his hands. But looking at that, you mentioned it, the Broncos defense, they looked really pretty good. That defensive line has been a question for them over the years, but they were really getting back into the backfield, pressuring Jamarcus Russell. Only got 2 sacks, but they forced a couple incompletions and just made him rush his throws a few times. But what else stood out for you about the Broncos defense?
Well, of course, you got those 2 cornerbacks in Dre Bly and Champ Bailey, and they were going up against inferior competition with Ashley Lally, Chaz Schillens, and Ronald Curry. But they didn't really need to make any big plays. They did look good when the time called for it. That defense overall just shut the Raiders down. In the first half, it looked like the Raiders would get some momentum, and then they would shoot themselves in the foot, or the Broncos would hold them and force them to punt. So I really liked what the Broncos brought defensively.
Yeah, it definitely looks like the Broncos are still very much the second team in this AFC West. Of course, not ready to put the Chargers away yet, even though they lost to Carolina. And so, granted, it's only one game, and you can't really tell whether it was that, are the Raiders really that bad, or the Broncos really that good, but for one game on one night, the Raiders were that bad, and the Broncos looked that good. So that's it for us. Tune in next week.